We're now in public session. So I wish to draw your attention to the fact that by virtue of 17(2)(l) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect to their evidence to this committee. However, if you're directed by the Chairman to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you're entitled thereafter only to qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You're directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you're asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that where possible you should not criticise or make charges against any person, persons or entity by name or in such ways to make him, her or it identifiable. I also wish to advise you that any submission or opening statements that you've made to the committee will be published on the committee webpage after this meeting. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the Houses or an official either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. I remind members to turn off your mobile phones or to switch them onto flight mode as they interfere with the broadcasting and streaming services. So I'd like to welcome our witnesses to our meeting today. We have Mr. Jeremy Godfrey, Commissioner, Mr. Donal Levy, Director of Wholesale, and Ms. Barbara Delaney, Director of Retail and Consumer Services. I will now ask Mr. Godfrey to make an opening statement. We have received your submission, so you can consider that as read. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. And I know the committee is under time pressure, so I'll be as quick as I possibly can. How do I move forward? Sorry. How do I click the slides forward?
The presentation, sorry.
Yes.
Yeah.
If you go on to slide 3, please.
Yeah,
that one. So I'll skip over some slides because of the time, but I'd maybe just like to inform, first of all, thank the committee for the opportunity to give evidence, and I'll focus on the wholesale, on the broadband markets. I think the point I'd like to first make to the committee is that Comreg's objectives in regulating the wholesale broadband market, we don't regulate retail markets, we regulate the wholesale market, but our objectives are really to ensure that end users get the benefit of choice and competition, and they get the benefit of efficient investment in new networks and new services. And I have a few slides just to illustrate how that has worked out. So Comreg's made a major decision in 2013 about what the rules should be for the wholesale access to Eir's high-speed network, which they were just rolling out. As I say, we had the objectives of promoting competition and so forth. In that time, you can see that the speeds available and taken up by consumers in Ireland have increased. So the red line there is speeds greater than 30 megabits per second. In 2013, when we made that decision, it was a little bit under 30%, whereas in the most recent figures we have now, it's almost 3/4 of all users have speeds above 30 megabits per second. I think the one thing to acknowledge is that the commercial rollout that has enabled that to happen has been in an area of the country where it's commercially viable, and there is of course an area where it's not been commercially viable for Eircom or for its competitors to roll out high-speed broadband, and that's the subject of the government's intervention programme, but that's a matter for them, not for us. Thanks. If you move to the next one. So another consequence, I mentioned that competition and providing choice was one of our objectives. So as you can see, that competition has also developed over that time. You can see a growth in the market share taken by Sky, which is the dark blue line at the second from the top, and also growth in the share taken by Vodafone, largely at the expense of the two players who were the largest back in 2013. And it's important also to say that Vodafone and Sky's ability to compete in the market depends very much on their use of Eircom's network. And if it wasn't for the rules that Comreg had put in place to ensure there was access to those networks, we'd just really have the two big players of Virgin and Eircom. Thank you. And in terms of the platforms, so again, you can see that the rollout of the investment by Eircom Virgin has also slightly extended its network, has also increased the speeds over that time. And you can see how the top half, from the light blue upwards, the number of customers using those higher speed service net platforms has grown, and the customers using the lower speed platforms has fallen. And again, it's interesting to note, I think, that the two blue bars are both Eircom platforms. So that shows how Eircom, both in its retail business and in the services used by wholesale customers using Eir's network, have also shifted from Eir's lower speed services to the higher speed services. And the last thing to talk about, because I know it was something discussed at the previous sessions you had on this topic, is the fibre to the home, which is the red bar at the very top. So that's really only just got going. Some of that is Eircom's fibre to the home in rural areas. Some of it will be Cyro in some of the second-tier towns. Thank you. And lastly, there was a comment made, I think, at one of your previous sessions about whether Comreg was too pro-competition and not pro-investment enough. We don't think there's actually a tension between the two things. One of the biggest incentives to invest is the need to meet competitive threats. And I'm sure that deputies who get complaints from constituents about unavailability, it's usually in the areas where there's less competition rather than the areas where there's more competition. Certainly that's been our experience. And you can see, in fact, that the investment figures have been held up very well over that time. I think investment can be a bit cyclical depending on what's going on in the marketplace, but I think there's no evidence at all of investment being deterred by regulation. And of course, in the last few months, we've seen an announcement by Eir of a further big investment programme of fibre to the home in urban areas. Thank you. I just want to give a little bit of context about how we regulate. So the way we regulate the wholesale markets is set by a European framework, and there are really three questions that we have to answer. One is we have to look at the wholesale markets and see, is there any operator in those markets which has significant market power? That means, could they do what they liked without having to worry too much about what impact competition would have on them? If we find someone that does have significant power, market power, then we have to think about, well, what problems could that cause, and how can we remedy the problems? And the way we remedy the problems is by requiring them to allow competitors to have access to their network, and we set a number of conditions about how that access is to be granted. And one of them that's very important is, how should the prices be set? I won't go through all the steps on the top, but just to observe, there are many steps that have to go through. There's a lot of data. It's very painstaking. There's a number of consultations, other people involved. So can take a bit of time to do. But once we've made our decisions, also the box on the right, monitoring what's going on, checking that Eircom is complying, enforcing when they don't comply. Those are extremely important tasks for us, and we also will often update the remedies, particularly the pricing remedies, as the data changes. Thank you. So we've notified, we got to the next to last stage of notifying our decisions to the European Commission, and those notified decisions are public. I can tell the committee that just a few hours ago we've got the comments back from the European Commission. They had no serious doubts, very few comments, so there will be no delay as a result of that process. So we'd expect to make those decisions final within the next week or two. In terms of what we're proposing, it's the usual remedies of Eir having to provide access to third parties who want to use its fibre, its copper networks, its ducts and poles. The second one is very important, that Eir must act in a way that doesn't discriminate. It must treat its own retail business the same as it treats third parties. That was again a big issue, I think, in some of your previous hearings on this matter. The other thing I'll just comment on this slide is we are planning to remove regulation from some parts of the market. So whilst the last mile, the connection from the telephone exchange or from the exchange to the customer's premises, we're continuing to regulate. Previously, we'd regulated also the backhaul from the exchanges to the central part of the network, and we are reducing the area in which we're imposing that regulation. Thank you. And I wanted to sort of talk specifically about prices because that was, again, something that had come up. So we are proposing to reduce the prices charged by Air for the use of the last mile of their network. And we're moving the basis of regulation. Previously, Air had a lot of flexibility in what price they charged, as long as they left enough room between their retail prices and their wholesale prices, so that competitors could make a margin. For the fibre to the cabinet service, we are now changing that and setting the precise price that Air is allowed to charge. And so those prices will come down compared with what Air is currently charging. And I'll talk a little bit about the fibre to the home connection charge, which was something that raised in both the last sessions. So at the moment, Air is free to set that charge as it wishes, subject only to, again, the rules on there being a sufficient margin between wholesale prices and retail prices. But I think we've been concerned about that charge. At the last hearing you had, I think Air informed the committee that its cost of connecting a premises on average was €450. And that's not a number that Comreg has verified, but we'll take it as correct for now. And I think the committee asked a very good question of them, which was how long does the asset last? And the answer I think you were given was that it lasted for 20 years. So the problem was that that connection charge is the best part of 2/3 of the cost of the asset, for which will last 20 years. But on average, a competitor might retain the customer and retain the use of that asset for only 42 months on average. So there's a real mismatch between the real risk they would have to take in paying that proportion of the costs with no guarantee that they would retain the customer for that long. So we thought that had a significant potential to inhibit the development of competition. In fact, so far we haven't seen any competitors use that fibre to the home network. We think that may be one of the reasons. And so we are changing the regulation. We're still giving Air some flexibility about the charge, but we've changed the rules. And we think that the amount that they will charge might be in the range of €80 to €150. They'll still have some flexibility. Thank you. And the last thing I'll talk about, which again came up in previous sessions that you had, was about Comreg staff and Comreg powers. It's quite unusual, I think, for regulated entities, for people who are being regulated, to ask for the regulator to have more staff and more powers. I have to say we agree with them. We think that if we did have more staff, we'd be able to move more quickly, do more things, fulfill our remit, which is very broad, a little bit better. And equally, we think that having adequate deterrent powers is very important. In other sectors and in other member states, it's common for regulators to have the ability to directly impose financial penalties. We've been discussing both these issues with the government. I think they're both regarded as high priority issues. I would say we, of course, recognise, particularly on the issue of staff, that there are wider public policy issues at play in terms of the overall size of the public sector. So just because we think we need something, it doesn't mean that that's the right thing for the government to do. So the ultimate decisions on these will be, of course, a matter for the government, and on the question of powers, ultimately a matter for the Oireachtas. Thank you. And that's a gallop through the slides.
It's much appreciated. I just have one or two questions before I bring in the members. Just would you consider carrying out an external independent analysis of the regulatory environment similar to the one undertaken by CRU? They undertook a peer review. That's one question. And just in relation to the Styles report, Air was found in breach of regulation, and subsequently there were investigations from Cartesian and KPMG. I know that Air expressed surprise that other members of the industry They expressed surprise that other members of the industry were upset by the breaches found. And just what are Air, and I know there are High Court proceedings. I'm not asking you to get into any detail, but just in general, would you take these breaches seriously, our Comreg? What are your views on that? I might ask you those questions before I move to Deputy Ryan, who has indicated to come in. Thank you.
Let me talk first about the SARS report.
Yes.
So, to put this into context, this is to do with AIR's regulatory governance model. So regulatory governance is very important because if AIR doesn't have a good way of managing its compliance, it won't know whether or not it's complying. We won't know whether or not it's complying, and the industry won't know. And of course, if the industry doesn't know, that can affect their confidence to invest. So this is something that has been an ongoing discussion between us and AIR for many years. Back in 2013, they started a program called Wholesale Compliance, which was intended to address some of those issues. We had said that after that program had been running for a while, we would review it, and based on on our evaluation of how well it was doing, we would decide whether or not we needed to do any more. So the STARS report was one of the reports that was produced as a result of that programme, and we encouraged Eircom to publish it in the interests of transparency. That report disclosed a number of failings, and actually I should maybe say it did also disclose some good things. So I think AIR had made some progress on some of the operational issues in terms of things like order processing, particularly around its mature products. But it did disclose some particular breaches, some of which we had already identified ourselves and we were taking compliance action about. And I think it probably speaks for itself that we've taken 5 compliance cases and we've sought penalties from the court of, I think, is it 10 million in respect of those cases. And there's a 6th case where we've formed an opinion of non-compliance, but we haven't yet taken it to court. So I think that speaks for the seriousness with which we see the breaches. Following the SARS report, we decided to commission Cartesian and KPMG to review how well the governance model was working. As I say, those reviews found some good things, but it did also find some very serious flaws, particularly around strategic decision-making and incentives and some issues around IT. So we consulted the industry as well to ask for their views on it, and we've been in discussions with AIR about how those things can be remedied. We may take regulatory action, but we're also in discussions about them doing something on a non-regulatory basis. Those discussions are part of some settlement discussions relating to some ongoing legal action. We were in court, I think, on Monday this week, and we informed the court that those discussions were going well, and that we'd hoped that by, I think, the 12th of November, which is the next court date that was set, that we would have finalised an agreement by then. But as that is part of I'd say ongoing court proceedings, I don't really want to say much more than that.
And in relation to the peer review, to do something similar that Crew carried out with the OECD, would Comreg look at doing something similar?
In time we might. I think one of the things that's happening at the moment in the telecoms space is that there's an entirely new European regulatory regime coming into force. A whole new code. I mean, many of the provisions will be developments of what we have at the moment. So one of the things that's going to be necessary for Comreg is to work out what difference that makes to us, how we might change the way we do things in implementing the code. So I think it would be more timely to consider any kind of external review at some point in the future after we've implemented those changes.
Bring in Deputy Ryan next.
Thank you very much indeed for a most interesting and useful presentation. I have a couple of general questions. On the retail market, you showed becoming more competitive, clearly with the 6-5 operators there reasonably split. Although you do kind of make the point, as you said yourself, that Vodafone and Sky pretty much is AIR, certainly on the last mile. Do they use AIR for the backhaul as well? Are they using the entire AIR network in terms of getting that service, or do they tend to separate out what backhaul, their retail kind of last mile to the connection to the customer, and then do separate backhaul, or is that typically an integrated package?
So they've increasingly used their own backhaul facilities rather than relying. Rather than relying on air, which is I said earlier, we are deregulating parts of the backhaul market, and that's a reflection of the fact that there's now alternatives to air for backhaul in many parts of Ireland.
I was going to ask you about that because I was surprised in a sense, just from casual conversation with different operators, it doesn't seem that there's been a huge development of backhaul alternatives in terms of, and certainly using state infrastructure. If you ask the question, are we using ducting on roads, or my understanding the rail network is that still with BT? I can't remember now who had it, but what are the main? ESB obviously have their figure 8 backhaul network, but could you just outline to me why are you deregulating the backhaul? Broadly outline what the options are if I was an operator.
There actually has been quite an extensive rollout of backhaul, as you'd expect in more populated areas in the last, say, 5 to 10 years. BT is a very important player. So, for example, Sky would be making more use of BT than it would of anybody else at the moment. Vodafone has rolled out some of its own infrastructure for its own use. You have players in the high-capacity business market like Airspeed. You have obviously the state infrastructure managed by ENET. So, in fact, there's been quite a lot of backhaul has been rolled out in the past 5 to 10 years.
Just take that last one, Airspeed. You said, what are they using, and how do the mans connect in on it?
Well, Airspeed is wireless.
Oh, sorry, Airspeed
is wireless, yeah. So BT essentially is using Eircom's network for the last mile, and then it's using its own infrastructure to get to a fairly substantial number of exchanges.
So is it mainly BT or Air?
BT, our own build. Virgin obviously is an independent network entirely.
And where are they running their backhaul on? What are they physically using? Are they using fixed wireless again as well? Or?
Mostly fibre in urban areas, but possibly, say, on the mobile side, still some fixed wireless to mass, but mostly it's fibre.
And fibre in terms of shipping it around the country?
So for main trunk routes, backhaul routes, we're talking about own use of fibre.
Okay. On what network? Or on what ducts? On what infrastructure? So
Virgin is using its own network to a large extent. BT is using a mixture of its own build. It's using some Eircom infrastructure. Vodafone again is using some of its own infrastructure.
And Sky
is more an infrastructure light player. It's renting from other players.
So Virgin or Sky, to take those two, what actually, if they're coming, let's say, run something up from Cork to Dublin, or from, let's say, Sligo to Galway, whatever.
Yeah.
What actual infrastructure are they using?
So Sky is renting from other people to a large extent. Sky doesn't use its own infrastructure. It's using mainly BT, as I understand it. Virgin, I don't know exactly how their network is configured, but to a large extent they're using their own infrastructure, their own cable infrastructure into local homes. I couldn't say they're using exclusively their own infrastructure. I don't have visibility of that. Okay. But to a large extent they're quite independent of Eircom.
The other two questions I have, if I can. The fibre to the home is still very small. Do you see cable to the home as being equivalent? Has there been any difficulties with contention or other kind of characteristics of that cable that make it, or would you see it as technology compatible with fibre to the home? And is that small red sliver there, is that mainly part of Eircom's access to those 300,000 rural broadband users that are not in the National Broadband Plan? Is there any urban figures yet coming up? Is that what's accounted for by that red slice?
Let me just answer this question. So in terms of cable and fibre to the home, there are obviously different technologies with different characteristics. Fibre to the home is capable of speeds up to 1 gigabit per second. The cable, I think the highest speed that's offered on retail at the moment is 300 megabits per second. And as you say, the contention issues are also different between the two networks. So they will compete with each other, undoubtedly, but they'll have a different proposition for customers. In terms of the figures, I think we haven't broken down publicly between when we publish, because of commercial sensitivity, how much of that is on the Eircom network, how much of it is on the Cyro network. But those would be the two main fibre to the home rollouts.
All right, yes, I forgot about Sarah in that figure as well. And then the last question I have is, while you recognise the welcome increase in fixed mobile broadband or fixed broadband investment in recent years, it's quite noticeable that the mobile broadband has kind of halved almost. I don't know if you have a latest an indication of what the mobile broadband spend would be in 2018, if you have any indicative figure. And I mean, while you can understand, as you see, that fixed increases and people increasingly using Wi-Fi hotspots to kind of off their mobile system, it's still rather worrying. I mean, given that we should be moving towards next generation, there's a lot of parts of the country still don't have 4G, it would seem to me, or, you know, the network coverage is really poor. I can never get, I have to stop using mobile calls around here because my network is losing all the time. My bloody phone has got radio on it and it's no use because every now and then you lose the radio signal because why is that mobile investment falling when my quality of even for voice or for mobile internet away from a hotspot or Wi-Fi connection is really poor? Are you slightly concerned about that?
I think your question is about the
fall in mobile investment when my service is not improving.
Yeah, I think, as I said, I think mobile investment is quite cyclical. So there was a large investment when 4G was first being rolled out, and there's continuing investment to continue to improve the quality of 4G that operators are making. I think we are concerned about the mobile customer experience. This has been a matter that I think we've discussed with this committee. You know, most times we've been before you recently. We've done a number of things about the mobile customer experience. Partly there's some issues, there are things that users can do to help themselves. So we've been testing out handsets so that users who are getting in a marginal coverage area who have a poor experience, if they can identify whether they might be able to improve their experience through a better handsets. We've liberalised the use of mobile phone repeaters so that people can get better coverage better service inside their own home. So we will be producing towards the end of this year a coverage map, which will be the first time that there'll be authoritative, independent information for people to have about how they can expect different networks to perform in different locations. So those are all things that can help with the mobile customer experience. Longer term, we will, towards the beginning of 2020, be assigning some further spectrum. And I know that coverage obligations will be front and centre of our consideration about how to run that assignment process.
Okay. And have you any indication of the figure for 2018 in mobile spend yet? You won't have
of
2018 spend, capital investment in mobile. Given the last 4 years, it's dropped each year.
I think the numbers we have there are the latest ones we have.
Okay. Thank you.
Sorry, Senator Tim Lombard. Yeah.
Thanks, Chair. If I could just follow on the theme that we were talking about regarding mobile phone coverage and where you see that space going. There is a proposal regarding local authorities to map out where these areas are black spots, and I think that was announced last year that all this process was happening and local engineers were testing main roads to see where. So what I'm asking, the map that you'll be producing, how in depth will it go down to? Will it go down to that level of minute detail, showing gaps in roads, gaps in... And there is talk that local government infrastructure will be used to increase the coverage. Have you been involved in that process to any degree?
Comreg has been a participant in the government's mobile phone coverage task force. So I'll answer your question about the detail of the map. Maybe I'll give a little bit of information about how we're producing our map. So we've obtained from all the operators the information about where their masts are, what kind of technology they have on the mast, what kind of antennas they have on the mast, what power they have. And we're using that raw information to, using standard engineering rules, to predict the signal strength. And actually our model is based on, I think, a 10-metre square. So the signal strength is really quite a fine level of detail. And so the map will have that kind of that resolution to be able to see what the coverage is. Now, obviously, these are engineering predictions, and you can get the actual amount, the actual experience may differ because of leaves growing on trees. All sorts of things can affect it, but that will be a very fine-grained prediction. And of course, the prediction model is also calibrated through on-the-ground drive tests. So I think in putting together the model, we've done 96 different drives in different parts of Ireland in different circumstances to make sure that we tune the model, the prediction, so that it matches reality. So that will be, I think, a very good piece of information for people. I think you talked about local authority infrastructure. So one of the things that has certainly been difficult for mobile operators in improving their coverage has been finding sites to put masts on for various reasons. And I think it's been a very good initiative to have the mobile and broadband officers in the local authorities to help address that.
Deputy Lawless.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair.
And welcome to witnesses here today. I have a couple of questions. The first one is in regard to the wholesale broadband market review. And I think it was recently, am I right in saying it was recently published? Or has it?
So we've recently notified our proposed final decisions to the Commission.
Right.
As I said earlier, in fact, this morning we heard back from the Commission they don't have any serious questions about them. So we should be able to proceed to make final decisions.
Okay. So it's not published yet, but it's in the process. Yes. It's nearly.
I mean, the notification is public on the Commission's website, but we haven't published it ourselves.
Okay. I did understand that the Commission were taking enforcement proceedings because of the delays on publishing that, and I understand that there's been, I suppose, delays to a number of similar items or reports coming through. So I suppose my question is, rather than beating you up about that, to throw it the other way and say, do you feel you have sufficient resources to deal with these? I mean, given the delays in that review and other reviews, have you sufficient resources at the moment?
Yeah. Well, I suppose in common with every other public body, when the financial crisis came, we reduced our headcount, we had a moratorium on recruitment, and of course that did make a big difference to our ability to deliver these reviews, which are very complicated. There's no question that if we'd had more resources, we would have been able to deliver these reviews more quickly. We do think that we need more resources in the market analysis area. We've taken steps also to improve our productivity, and we've redeployed resources within Comreg to help. But we have sought more resources from the government. We're in a discussion with our department about that. It's a high priority for them, I know. But as I said earlier, that of course, there are wider government policy issues about the overall size of the public sector and so forth, which are not particularly Comreg issues, but obviously need to be taken into account when the government makes its decision about whether or not to authorise us to increase our headcount.
Okay. I understand from the budget figures that came out this week that Comreg received 62 million back to the Exchequer in 2018. Would it have been an option to retain some of that for additional resources, or within the organisation to maybe manage some of these projects?
So the way our headcount is controlled is that Comreg before we decide what our numbers are, we need the consent of the government to decide our headcount. So we're funded from levies and charges. So really the headcount is almost a separate issue from that. We don't have the right to spend that money on extra staff without getting a separate sanction from the government.
Okay, so the government would let you keep it, in other words?
Well,
you're mandated to return it to the Exchequer, is that right?
The legal framework we operate under is that we raise money through fees and charges, we spend the money on our activities, and any surplus we have, we give to the Exchequer.
But how do you generate a surplus? Is the surplus what's left over after your activities have been costed?
Yes. So the difference between the fees and charges and the cost of running Comreg is the surplus, and that goes to the Exchequer.
But then if you had extra activities, you would have a smaller surplus, is that right?
Other things being equal.
Okay, but does the power lie within your organisation to expand your activities in order? I'm just trying to understand what funding is available to you, because I know some cemetery organisations behave in a similar manner, but do you have executive control? I mean, can you make a decision that that 62 million, for example, would be spent on fast-tracking the broadband market review instead of receiving it to government?
So we have a lot of flexibility about our level of, about what our activities. The one thing we don't have flexibility about is the number of staff we employ.
Okay.
So our staff numbers require...
Right. So the only way to spend the money is pay them more?
I think we also have some constraints on that as well.
I'm sure. Okay, could you hire contractors? Is that an option?
It's an option. So we do use both agency staff and consultants to assist us in our business, but it's important to, of course, to retain knowledge inside the organisation. There's only so far you can go in that way.
Okay. You might have. I was watching some of the initial presentation from my office, but I didn't catch all of it. I appreciate it may be sensitive or may be difficult, but I suppose the National Broadband Plan has been mired in difficulties on many levels. Do you have an opinion on that or a view on that you're in a position to share?
No, I think the National Broadband Plan procurement process is really a matter for the government.
Okay. Sure, the procurement is, but in terms of I suppose, are you confident that it will deliver? I mean, I suppose we've seen timelines come and go, and we've seen, we're several years on, and we still don't have, my constituents in rural Kildare don't have broadband in many cases. It's the same around the country. I saw something in your presentation about the last mile, for example. I mean, sorry, I apologise I missed it, but were you expressing a view that the last mile piece could be done maybe in different ways, or what was the gist of that?
So I think, when I was talking about the last mile, I was really talking about the way we regulate access to the last mile infrastructure provided by the operator with significant market power, which is air. I think issues, so the National Broadband Plan, as you talk about, that's really, as I say, it's a matter for the government. It's their programme. We're not involved in the procurement process for that project at all.
Okay. Just a last question then on the metropolitan area networks. Does ComReg have any part in the oversight of demands?
No.
No, not at all. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to thank you for coming in this afternoon for this engagement, and we will be publishing your presentation on our committee webpage. So this committee, joint committee, is adjourned until 5 p.m. Wednesday the 17th of October.